looked up at me sharply. I don't understand that stuff about viruses that she was saying. What's going on? Are we going to be sick? He asked, looking so helpless and little in his tiny windbreaker and jeans. I don't know what she's talking about, but we need to get out of here right now. I'm sure that we'll be fine if we can just get past the borders of the town. At least I think so. And I also think some sort of biological outbreak is causing people to go insane. As if on cue, a car sped past, fire leaping out of the shattered windows. I smelled burning rubber, hot metal, and roasting meat. A disgusting combination of aromas that the nightmarish scene had left in its wake. The driver hit a tree, flying through the windshield and smashing his body into the trunk at an incredible speed. I saw by the awkward angle of his neck that he was either dead or dying. He looked like a bird who had flown into a window, snapped in the head, lolling weakly at a 45-degree angle on a totally broken spine. I turned to look at him sharply. Where's your mother? In the house, he said. I took the keys out of the ignition, grabbing Anthony's small hand and running towards our home of 10 years. I kept looking left and right for the corpse girl, but she hadn't reappeared yet. I wondered if Anthony truly was so powerful that he could scare her away for good. I seriously doubted it. I had a feeling that she was biding her time, and probably watching us at this very moment. The thought sent chills down my spine. As I walked into the entranceway, I started yelling her name, trying to get her out of here as soon as possible. Margaret, I screamed. Anthony was next to me screaming. Mom, where are you? I led him to the kitchen first, where I grabbed a butcher knife and gave Anthony a smaller but still very sharp one from the drawer. Don't hurt yourself by accident with it, kiddo, I said. Only use it as a last resort. He nodded. I wish I had guns here, but we... At that moment, my words were cut off by a wailing and pain-filled shrieking from upstairs. I took Anthony's hand, unwilling to be separated from him for any reason now, and kicked open the master bedroom door. There I saw our priest, Father Lanigan, with a pistol to my wife's head. She was very clearly sick, bleeding from her eyes and nose, a waterfall of mess spilling out of his heaving and gasping mouth. I put my hands up. Father Lanigan, I said loudly and simply, put down the gun, you're sick. He just breathed louder and faster, his gray eyes beginning to film over with milky and blood-smeared cataracts. He reminded me more and more of that girl. Even his stare was similar, an almost reptilian glower that looked down on everything and everyone around. I took a step forward. All of his attention was focused on me. His gun hand shook hard. Look, Father, you aren't like this, I said. You can. But I never got to finish my sentence. At that moment, my son, small and brave, ran through the alternate door to the master bedroom, his small knife raised above his head like a tiny Amazonian warrior. Let go of my mommy, Anthony said, plunging the knife into Father Lanigan's stomach. The priest howled in pain and I ran forward, grabbing his gun hand just as he was aiming it at my son. I pushed it up with all of my strength and the shout went high, blowing apart a dresser drawer. I took the knife and shoved it directly through his right eye. His other eye widened in surprise, the tears coming faster for a moment, and then he slumped to the floor. My heart racing, I grabbed the gun out of his hand, making sure that it wasn't pointed at my son or wife in case that he had the strength to pull the trigger one last time. And as it turns out, he did. The last shot went right through the window, the tinkling of glass mixing with the ringing in my ears from the gunshots at such a close distance. And then I had the revolver out of his hand, putting it into my back pocket and sighing. Let's get out of this madhouse of a town, I said to my wife. She only cried and hugged me, putting her face against my shoulder for a few moments. And then we ran outside, grabbing some bottled water and canned foods on the way and throwing them in a plastic bag. I drove out of there as quickly as I could, entering the fields and woods at the edge of town. But just as I was about to cross over into the next town, I found that the road was blocked. Dozens of bodies were stacked on top of one another, crossing the road and the sides of the road. There was no possible way around them. Half of them were only wearing torn rags, and some of them still twitched and moaned. They were all crying, vomiting, and it ran down the group. I pulled over, putting my head against the steering wheel, and I cried. I tried calling for help, but no phone calls would connect. The internet still worked, so I wrote up what had happened. In case my family and I don't make it out of here, I wanted somebody to know what's really happened in my town. Sighing in frustration and despair, grabbing the revolver and handing the butcher knife to my wife, we all got out of the car and started walking. As we walked past the pile of bodies stacked like cordwood in a pile 20 feet high, the wind seemed to pick up. The horrible smell emanated from the pile, nearly making me throw up. My son Anthony and my wife Margaret both tried to hide their faces in the crook of their elbows, their skin looking pale and all too white. I heard my little boy suppress a small retch, bending over as the smell grew stronger for a few moments. And then we were walking away, and though it was still terrible, the smell started to fade after a few hundred feet. I had driven on this road out of town hundreds of times in my life, and yet I realized I didn't recognize my surroundings. Furrowing my brow, I looked around. The pavement in front of us had turned white. I saw tiny bones placed closely together, forming the streets. The trees had also changed. They looked like weeping willows, but instead of long strands of leaves hanging down, they had what looked like intestines and long strands of hair blowing softly in the breeze, moving from side to side. As we drew closer, I realized thousands of bugs swarmed in the otherworldly branches. The concerted motion of so many insects gave them a shimmering, vibrating quality. There was a sound like high-pitched crying that came out of the forest, and as I looked closer, I realized these sounds were coming from the trees themselves. "Where are we?" my wife asked, her eyes wide, her body trembling. My heart beat so fast that I could no longer differentiate the separate beats. They all slammed together in a concerted frenzy as I realized we had walked right out of our world and into the world of the monstrous corpse girl and her insane god that my son had told me about. "She told me they call it Golgotha," my son whispered. "The place of the skulls." "But how did we get here?" I asked. "And more importantly, how do we get out? Can't we just turn around?" I looked back down the road and realized the pile of bodies that had marked the entrance to this mad world was now gone. I saw only the white street paved with bones stretching off into the horizon, endless forests of willows with blood and intestines hanging from them lining each side. Nearby, I heard the gurgling of a stream. "No," my son said softly. "We are in here and I can feel their presence. The dead girl. She's watching us right now. She's trying to get in my..." He pointed at his head. "We have to go on ahead. I can keep her out though. She won't be able to get inside any of you if you're near me. I know how to fight her. She can try to reach inside of me or me inside of her." My wife grabbed my free hand tightly. I prayed to God that Anthony was right, that I wouldn't end slashing myself open to let unknown viruses in, or be forced to do something to my family by telepathic control, or something else that was hard to imagine, but had become only too real today. "I'm scared," she whispered to me too quietly for my son to hear. I nodded to her grimly, opening the revolver and checking the bullets. I had only 4 left, and I didn't even know if bullets would harm the things in this place. Then we heard a voice that seemed to boom from the sky. It was deep and shaking the ground. Pieces of intestines fell from the trees around us, and the streets of bone shook, some of them falling out of place like pure white potholes. I grabbed my wife, steadying her as she almost toppled over. My son seemed almost unaffected, but his eyes were wide and he was looking straight up. I looked up also, seeing the sky had begun to rapidly turn from blue to black, as if an eclipse were happening. But I could see no sun, no source of light, no moon or stars. Instead, I only saw a face begin to emerge from the darkness. It was a face that seemed to stretch hundreds of miles across. Its skeletal cheekbones and bleached white forehead seemed to blend into the blackness of the sky. Its chattering jawbone and massive pointed teeth opened and closed quickly in an eerie shuffling way that didn't match at all its words. It reminded me of a wind-up toy that I had had as a child, one that just had teeth that would chatter and bounce off of each other as the toy moved forward in a random way. But its eyes were its most disconcerting feature. They were pure silver, but in that silver there was a rapid shimmering and rotating. Madness emanated from every part of its face, and I felt it looking deep into my mind. It had a presence that was not only insane but insectile, antithetical to life, and worst of all, eternal. "Have you brought me a new lamb for the slaughter?" it said in a voice like rushing water. "Give me the boy. He will have company with the dead ones, the other boys and girls here. They're all dead, but nothing here ever really dies. Give me your child and I'll let you go." And then it stopped speaking, the only movement in the whole sky being its eyes, which now revolved faster, deeper, and lighter shades of silver, appearing and disappearing in a rapidly moving fractal pattern that seemed to zoom forever inwards towards the center. "No," I said simply, my heart beating fast but a rising sense of anger battling it and giving me new strength. I put up my middle finger and aimed it at the sky. The voice laughed louder than ever. I heard trees falling in the forest surrounding us, the stream no longer gurgling but being thrown around like tidal waves on the banks of its shore. "Then you will all die," it said, its voice fading as if zooming away from us. And then the face and the blackness were gone, the sky returning to a deep blue. Light seemed to return to the world, and the eerie insectile fingers that had grasped and felt around my mind disappeared in an instant. On the horizon above the trees, I realized that I could see thick dark clouds of smoke rising above the tree line. The road seemed to head in that general direction. Motioning with my hand, I turned to my family. "It looks like there could be some sort of town or factory over there," I said. "If we keep going on this road, it'll probably bring us close. Or we could turn around and walk back in the opposite direction. What do you two think?" My question was broken by a sob from the nearby trees. Whirling around, I saw Trooper Shea, his dress uniform torn, cuts and scrapes all over his body. His mouth turned into a perfect O of surprise, his eyes widening as he looked at us. "Please," he said, "help me." And then he fell over like a rag doll, plummeting into the dry soil and dead grass that surrounded the skeletal road. My wife began to run over to him, but I put a hand on her shoulder, stopping her. "He could be infected," I said. She glared at me. "So you're just going to let him die?" she asked. I shook my head. "We approach danger slowly," I said. "We only have one revolver with a few shots, one butcher knife, and the small knife that we gave Adam, which is basically a paring knife." I laughed, even though it wasn't funny. The sound of laughter in this grim place just felt wrong, and I quickly stopped. Margaret just gave me one more disapproving frown and then pushed my hand away and knelt beside Trooper Shea. She had some medical training, having been a certified nursing assistant in her early 20s, and used it to check him over briefly. She checked his pulse, his breathing, opened one eye and then the other to check the responsiveness of his pupils, and make sure that no blood was coming out of either. Turning back to me, she nodded. "He doesn't seem sick like the others," she said. He was laying on his back and she flipped him over to check for injuries on that side. As soon as she did, we all saw the cause of his collapse. He was bleeding rather heavily. It looked like somebody had stuck a knife into the back of his left shoulder and then pulled it out again. The blood was clotting, staining his uniform a dirty red color on the back. He had clearly lost a great deal of blood. "I don't think they'd have hit an artery," my wife said to me. My son stood behind me, holding my free hand while I kept the revolver ready, scanning the forest and road for any sign of movement. At that point, Trooper Shea began to moan, his eyes fluttering open. "Do you," he said, licking his lips and clearing his voice, "water?" "Well, there is a stream nearby," I said, getting up. "I don't know if it's drinkable, however. For all I know, the streams here could be made of pure mercury." He shook his head. "They're water," Shea said, coming back more and more to consciousness as he spoke. "I drank some of it when I was running and it tasted fine." He got up slowly and my wife came running over. He put an arm around her, looking like he might fall over again, but after a few breaths, he steadied himself. "Something was chasing me. I don't know how I got here. One minute I was in the fields running towards the woods, and then suddenly, the trees had all changed and the sky went black. One of those nut jobs in the middle of town stabbed me in the back. My partner ended up getting bitten and became so sick within minutes that I knew there was no way of getting him out of there. He went down fighting though. He took out 5 or 6 of those people with him before they all jumped on him and began ripping his body apart with their teeth, their fingernails, everything. It was like a savage dog attack. We started walking towards the sound of the gurgling stream nearby. As soon as we reached the shallow bank, Trooper Shea fell to his knees, cupping his palms and drinking as much water as he could handle. And then he splashed it on his face and stood up. "All right, let's get out of this place," he said, pulling out his service pistol and putting a fresh magazine in it. We returned to the road and began to walk towards the smoke in the sky. Within minutes, the forest started to clear out and I saw towering buildings on the horizon drawing closer. It was eerie how quiet they were, however. I didn't hear a single car or bus coming from that direction. Soon the forest and the hanging intestines and everything were behind us, and we stood in a post-apocalyptic nightmare. Buildings hundreds of stories tall stood all around us, many with their windows smashed out. Bodies hanging from lampposts on both sides of the road. Many had been there for so long that the skin and muscle were sloughing off, rancid gas causing them to bloat, their faces unrecognizable, their clothes bowing out from the pressure of the decomposition. "The girl is coming," my son said, pointing down the road. We all had our weapons at the ready. It would have seemed absurd in other circumstances, being so afraid of a little girl no more than 4 feet tall. Her mouth, stitched closed, had dark blood dripping down from her lips and her eyes were wide and sparkling, almost smiling. Her deathly white skin showed black, rotten veins that wound throughout her body, hidden by the black rags that she wore in many spots. And then I heard her voice in my mind as she came to a stop. "The god of Golgotha welcomes you all," she said. I could tell by the widening eyes of the others that they had all heard her voice as well. "This is your last chance. A sacrifice is required to move forward. Give us the boy, we'll take good care of him for you. He will never die, nothing here ever really dies." At this, Trooper Shea raised the pistol and fired a shot. It hit her in the center of her chest, knocking her back. The voice stopped instantly. "Run," my son said. "There's more coming from behind us." Glancing back, I saw that it was right. Dozens of boys and girls were coming out of the abandoned skyscrapers, flooding the bone-white roads, all with their mouths stitched closed. Some wore decaying suits or the rags of dresses, while others looked much fresher, with intact shirts or pants still on their tiny bodies. Seeing that, we all sprinted away. I stayed behind my son, knowing that he would be the slowest of us all. The others rapidly gained on us, and I felt tiny hands grabbing at the back of my shirt trying to pull me back. Turning quickly, I fired a bullet into the nearest target, a small one with a suit that looked like it would have been new during World War II. The reaction of the others chasing us was immediate. They all stopped at the shot, their eyes widening as they saw the dark clotted blood and brain matter that sprayed the street behind the child. And then they placed their hands on the remains, trying to shove it through the stitches in their mouths. I heard deep slurping sounds as they sucked the red through the black stitching, pulling their lips apart so hard that fresh blood began to pour out of the stitches' insertion site as they tried to feast, taking in as much as they could. It gave us just the distraction that we needed. While they circled around it, eating the body like vultures surrounding a piece of roadkill, we got farther and farther away. Trooper Shea running in the lead, my wife behind him, and then my son and me. We took random turns going down long abandoned alleyways and moving deeper into the center of the city. Soon, we heard nothing at all besides the heavy footfalls of our group. "Stop," I said, gasping, bent over next to a dumpster filled with shoes in a tiny alleyway between two skyscrapers. "I need to rest." My son clearly did too. He was breathing hard, doubled over. Trooper Shea and Margaret turned to look at us. "What, now?" Margaret asked. I looked down at my son. "Do you have any idea how to get out of here?" I asked. Surprisingly, he nodded. "I got a glimpse from the girl's mind when she was talking to us," Anthony said. "But I think she saw some stuff in mine too. I don't know if it matters or not." I shrugged. "Hey, there's nothing we can do about that now. So, how do we get out of here?" "There's a well in the center of the city, where they go when they need fresh boys and girls to follow the god here, or when they need bodies to feed them." "So let's go," Trooper Shea said, pushing my son in front of him. "Lead the way, kid. We've got your back. Let's get out of this place." Nodding, Anthony started walking on shaky legs. We followed him out of the alleyway to a massive street 6 lanes wide. "It should be down this way," Anthony said, pointing deeper into the tangle of abandoned buildings. I saw a cloud of black smoke where his finger had pointed. And then we heard the voice of that insane god again, but not coming from the sky this time. It was on the street not far away. The ground started to shake. Turning to look in the opposite direction that my son had pointed, I saw a behemoth dozens of feet tall. It had the same skeletal face, the same chattering jawbone and sharpened teeth, but it now stood on a slender body with marks marring nearly every inch of its skin. "Thank you for delivering the lamb to me personally," it said in that voice so much like a waterfall, each syllable pounding into the other and causing small earthquakes as it spoke. There was no way that we could outrun it. Through its legs and arms were emaciated sticks with bones showing through its countless injuries. It was fast and very tall. My wife looked back at me one last time. "Get him out of here," she whispered to me, pointed at Anthony. "No matter what it takes." And then she ran directly at the insane god. Its head swiveled rapidly, its silver eyes following her progress with a kind of lunatic intensity. Its long arms reaching out to grab her, but she ducked into a nearby alleyway. The thing followed her, howling. "Run, you idiots," Trooper Shea said. I wanted to go help her, but I knew that he was right. She had likely given her life to save our son, and to do anything else but get us out would be a waste of her sacrifice. With tears pouring down my cheeks, I pushed my son ahead. "Go, Anthony," I screamed. Looking back at me bewildered, he looked like he would just stand there forever. "But what about Mommy?" he cried. "Just go." And then we all started to run. The black cloud of smoke was growing rapidly nearer when I heard the shrieks of a woman. I knew that it was Margaret. It sounded like she was being burned alive, a kind of pain and horror that I had never heard in any voice before, even as a 911 dispatcher. I could see the well that Anthony was talking about now only a few hundred feet away. Black clouds of smoke emanated from it, blocking out the sky above it. It seemed as if it had some eternal fire burning within it. And then the children began to crawl and run out from every street and alleyway surrounding the well, forming a rough circle around it. They all stopped and stared at us with their lifeless eyes. "I have an idea," Trooper Shea said, looking at me with shell-shocked eyes. but you're not going to like it." And then he ran forward, nearly emptying his magazine with a rapid succession of shots, aiming at the monstrous bodies that surrounded him. With the first 9 shots, he blew some of them apart, leaving huge exit wounds in their chest and heads as he fired rapidly. And then they closed all around him, and I knew that he was out of time and nearly out of ammo. Glancing back at me one last time, his eyes watery and terrified, he used the last of his ammo on himself and pulled the trigger. I saw it in slow motion. "No!" I screamed, but it was too late. The shot rang out, and the corpse children swarmed all over his body, dipping their small white hands into him, trying to shove as much of it as they could into their stitched mouths. Without a moment of hesitation, I lifted Anthony and ran forward, jumping into the well, the clouds of black smoke enveloping us as we fell. I woke up at the border of the town, surrounded by people in hazmat suits. I saw countless agents in unmarked black SUVs blocking off the border of the town. One man in a hazmat suit came over, shining a light in my eyes. I saw another doing the same to Anthony next to me, and then I fell back into unconsciousness. I awoke later in a medical facility surrounded by a few agents in black suits. They wouldn't tell me which agency they came from, but told me my entire town had an outbreak of a mutated form of rabies. I shook my head. "There was a girl with her mouth stitched closed," I said, and they laughed. A few of the other survivors said the same thing. Likely mass hysteria. Maybe a group hallucination from the stress of seeing such a horrifying outbreak. We have the entire town quarantined, however. So far, we've been able to keep this out of the media, and the goal is to continue to do that. We don't need you to go around talking about monsters. I stopped listening after that, knowing that they would never believe me. They never mentioned how many of the bodies were never found, including those of my wife and Trooper Shea, both of whom had sacrificed themselves to save us. Nor how a mutated form of rabies could stack hundreds of bodies into piles like cordwood, blocking off many of the roads into or out of town. Since then, Anthony and I have moved far away from that town, the one that took my wife and all of my friends. I thought that I had left the terror behind and started to heal. But then last night as I fell asleep, I had a dream of an insane god with chattering teeth and silver eyes, telling me that he would see me again soon. When I awoke, my floor was covered in footprints that left behind dark, clotted blood leading towards my bed. "911, what is your emergency?" I said, answering on the first ring. It had been a slow day up to that point, but that was all about to change in a moment.
"I just saw something bad."
A hysterical voice cried out on the other end of the line.
"My neighbor, she's outside, and she's bleeding."
"Bleeding from where?" I said.
"Everywhere,"
she screamed. I tried to get her address, but she was so hysterical that she kept yelling for help. Eventually, she calmed down enough to give me her street. I heard new voices in the background, all shrieking. "We have a unit on the way," I said. "Just stay on the line with me. It's going to be okay."
"No,"
she whispered, barely audible over the screaming in the background.
"It isn't."
A few minutes later, I was in the break room, getting a coffee and trying to stop my hands from shaking. I was hyperventilating, full of an incomprehensible terror and anxiety that I had never felt on this job before. Before the call had cut out, it sounded like a street full of rabid people had surrounded the caller's house. And then the radio came on from the police unit that had been first to arrive at the scene.
Dispatch, you there? This is Shay.
I heard the voice of Trooper Shay crackling. I immediately picked up on the backup unit that we kept in the break room. This is dispatch, I said. What's going on?
I came down Kansas Street from Union Road, and it's totally empty except for a few bloodstains. Were you able to get the house number of the caller?
He asked. Negative on that, I said. Do you see any broken glass or smashed down doors? It sounded like pure insanity at the end of the call. She claimed she was being attacked by one of her neighbors. Trooper Shay consulted with his partner on the street for a moment before responding.
We just heard screaming and glass shattering. It sounded like it came from number 67 on Kansas Street. Send backup.
I ran back to the main room. We had a new system that could live stream 911 calls directly to the cars of police in the area, as well as live stream audio from the car back to dispatch. I turned it on, entering the number of Trooper Shay's patrol car, and listened intently.
Come out with your hands up.
I heard Shay's partner yell. Shay gasped.
Oh God, she needs medical attention,
he said.
She's got blood coming out of her eyes, her ears, her nose, and she's vomiting. What do you think she has? Ma'am, stop right there.
Trooper Shay yelled.
Don't come any closer.
And then I heard a rash of swearing and yelling followed by a gunshot. I dropped my coffee cup on the floor, hearing it shatter and spread burning hot liquid across my shoes, but I was so engrossed and horrified by what I was hearing that I had barely noticed.
Oh God, she bit me,
Shay's partner said.
She bit my thumb off.
I heard another series of gunshots and then the slamming of car doors.
Go, go, go,
one of them said, and I heard the squealing of tires.
Oh crap, what is that?
Shay said, and then his voice came in over the radio.
Dispatch, this is Shay, and we have a major obstruction blocking the intersection of Kansas and Maine. It looks like... Okay, I know this is going to sound insane, but it looks like a pile of bodies. Literally hundreds of them, stacked on top of each other like firewood. Maybe they're just mannequins, I don't know, but most of them look like they're bleeding. We need backup immediately and emergency medical services as well. Trooper Ingram lost a finger when we got surrounded by a dozen drugged up or sick lunatics back there. One of them bit me on the calf through my uniform, but I don't think that it will require medical attention. They were biting, scratching, and hissing like snakes. There's something wrong here, I'm telling you.
This is dispatch, I said, and backup is on the way. I wanted to tell him to get the heck out of there and drive the other way, but I wasn't a cop. I had no authority to do any such thing. They would likely think it was their primary duty to secure and protect the scene until the other police arrived. My shift was about to end in a few minutes when this insanity began, and my replacement walked in just as I hung up the radio. She looked at me, one eyebrow raised. You are not going to believe this, I told her, and I briefed her on everything that was happening. Her mouth opened more and more as I recounted the story, her eyes widening in horror. And by the end, I still hadn't heard from Trooper Shay or his backup. I was having anxiety and just wanted to get out of there. My family lived nearby, and if there was some sort of crime spree or pandemic happening, I wanted to be home to protect them. My son was only 7 years old, and I knew that he couldn't protect himself in such an apocalyptic calamity as was occurring in our little town. As she sat down in the dispatcher's chair, another 911 call came in, and I took the opportunity to get my stuff and head out of there. I had only a 5-minute drive back home. My knuckles were white as I sped down the residential streets at 30 miles over the speed limit. Traffic was sparse and I saw nothing out of place. Until I turned onto my street, that is. My neighbor was an elderly man whose 6-year-old granddaughter lived with them. Both of them were standing in the middle of the road, staring up at the sun, their mouths agape. I saw long knives in each of their right hands. I slammed on the brakes a few feet away from them, but they didn't stir. I tried honking my horn, but they just kept staring up at the sky without any awareness. As I looked down from their faces, I realized they were both viciously sawing at their bodies, opening up slice after slice. A waterfall of red began to run down their skin, soaking into the pavement. I barely could keep it down. I backed up, driving on my neighbor's lawn to get around them, putting down the window to yell as I passed by. "What the heck are you doing, Mr. James?" I screamed at him. "Stop it." I wondered whether I should jump out and try to stop them, but with their current mental states, I felt